We've all heard the story before. Person runs on bad times or just wants to get ahead in life, so they sell their soul to the devil in exchange for prosperity or whatever it is they want. And while at first they seem to get it, they end up succumbing to the devil's influence. It all goes horribly wrong, and in the end, the only person to win is the devil himself. Now, of course, the moral of this story is a rather simple one, which, simply put, is that you can not trust evil. And it's a rather good one at that. So, as I probably don't even have to tell you, many have used this very basic template, whether literally or metaphorically, in their own stories, though usually in those cases, things go slightly different than the summary I just gave. And today I'd like to go over some movies that I believe did and didn't use this story template to bring every Christian's worst nightmare to life very effectively. But before I go any further, I would just like to warn you that there will be spoilers ahead for every movie I mention here. So in case I bring up something you don't want ruined, you should either click off the video or skip over that section. I will not be giving any other spoiler warnings here. Okay, so when telling a story about one selling their soul to the devil, again, either metaphorically or literally, it usually either goes one of two routes. Now, the rarer of the two is the one I just summarized, where the deal is sought to completion, everything falls apart, and the main character dies and is at the mercy of the devil for all eternity. Or, in a more metaphorical story, basically they either become a horrible person or their life just spirals out of control. And the second, and much more often used one, is that after realizing the error of their ways, usually through their own conscience or a reality check, the main character must either find a way out of the devil's grasp, or in a more metaphorical story, reject their evil influence and walk away from it no matter the cost. And what's also just as important is that they do something to redeem themselves of their actions while under the evil influence, thus cementing the fact that they've turned away from it for good. Now, of course, usually the first kind of story will be used on people the writers want to be seen as not very nice from the start, while the second is used more on people the writers want to be viewed as good at heart if misguided. Now, like I said, there is a good and a bad way to use this template, and I'd like to start out by talking about one of the best uses of it I've ever seen. And that's a 1941 movie called The Devil and Daniel Webster, based on the novella of the same name. Now, for those of you who don't know, The Devil and Daniel Webster is about a New Hampshire farmer who's extremely down on his luck. He's got a loving wife and friends, but can't get anywhere financially, seemingly running into problem after problem. Then on a particularly bad day, the devil himself, in the form of a traveling salesman, offers him 7 years of financial prosperity in exchange for his soul at the end of it. Though hesitant at first, the devil assures him that souls don't really matter, and with that assurance, coupled with the fact that he is not in a good headspace, he agrees, and the devil delivers immediately, claiming gold from a lost Spanish boat had been buried under his barn. Now, at first, he's actually pretty resistant to the devil's trying to get him to do questionable things, and instead tries to use his newfound good luck to help his friends get out from under the thumb of the richest and most hated man in town. However, after the birth of his son, the devil finally has enough of his messing around and numbs his conscience completely. And that is where things go downhill. From there, he prospers financially, all right, but that's the only area he does any good in. He becomes an even worse tyrant than the richest man in town, forcing his friends to sign impossible contracts to work for him, neglects his son, and starts having an affair with a woman supplied by the devil himself just to ensure his marriage will fall apart. And to top it all off, he's thoroughly miserable, even if he insists otherwise. Then he's finally able to break free of the devil's hold on him when he makes a sobering discovery that the richest man in town, the man everybody hated and despised so much, only got that way because he had sold his soul to the devil 7 years before. And then the devil comes to collect, and he next sees him as nothing more than a tiny moth begging him for help, trapped forever in the devil's pocket. Realizing the reality of what the devil has done to him, that souls do in fact matter, and that he is indeed not happy and has made everybody miserable, he tries to break the contract only for the devil to come collecting for him as well, offering him an extension only if he'll sell his son's soul to him as well. He absolutely refuses, however, and instead apologizes to his family for his behavior and resigns himself to his fate until his wife's famous lawyer friend Daniel Webster offers to help him. So when the devil comes collecting, Daniel Webster demands a trial, and the devil gives him one, though it's a kangaroo court if there ever was one. But long story short, Webster is able to save his soul in the end, and though the devil takes back what he had given him, the main character doesn't care, and instead severs his last connections to the devil by tearing up the contracts he had forced his friends to sign, thus regaining their respect. Now, to put it simply, this is one of the best uses of this template I've ever seen, because it does everything right. It's made clear from the start that he's a good man who's just run on desperate times that's thoroughly taken advantage of by the devil. But what's also important is that he does have a fall from grace as a result of his deal, even if it's mostly because of the devil's influence. And the most important part is his redemption. Because even before Daniel Webster saves him, he had already saved what was left of the good man he used to be because he refuses to sell his son to the devil. And what's particularly important about this is that he'd only been selfishly thinking of himself for the past few years at that point. But once he sees what really becomes of those who are condemned to the devil, he selflessly resigns himself to his fate rather than hand over his son to save himself. That's the moment he truly redeemed himself, and only takes this a step further after being given a new lease on life by freeing his friends from the virtual slavery he had previously condemned them to. To put it simply, he may have done some bad things, but nothing he couldn't reverse, which is what keeps him open to redemption. And when faced with quite possibly his most important decision in the entire movie, he makes the right choice with zero hesitation. But to use an example you guys are probably more familiar with, let's take a look at a more recent movie, The Devil's Advocate. And to briefly summarize, the movie is about a lawyer who agrees to work for a major attorney firm and quickly finds himself caring less and less about his client's innocence as well as what he has to do to get them off, even neglecting his wife as she seemingly spirals into insanity. Then it turns out his boss is literally the devil himself, having driven his wife to suicide because the devil wants him to father the Antichrist with his own half sister. Now, having spent the whole movie doing increasingly morally questionable things and lusting after the woman that is now throwing herself at him, he instead opts to kill himself in an act of redemption and to stop the devil dead in his tracks. However, he's then brought back to the beginning of the movie and seemingly given a second chance. Is it just the devil trying to get what he wants by any means necessary, or God rewarding him for doing the right thing? It isn't made clear. But what is made clear is that the devil can't make him do what he wants. So as long as he doesn't succumb to him, the world is safe. Now, once again, you can see that this movie is a good example of the template done right. Even if the exchanging of souls is never actually done, it's clear in all but name. Because once again, you see he's a good man driven to a fall from grace by the devil's influence, but when the chips are down, he instead does the right thing and decides to redeem himself at the cost of his own life. And what's very important to note here is that he had absolutely no way of knowing he would get a second chance, similar to the previous example as well, which makes his redemption feel all the more real and impactful as a result. So, with that being said, let's now take a look at some movies that didn't get this quite right. Now, please do note that these next examples, the selling the soul to the devil template, is only done metaphorically, but in every other respect applies exactly the same way as the two I just discussed did. And I feel the best place to start is by once again going back to a movie from the 1940s, this time a 1946 movie called The Hucksters. Now, to once again quickly summarize, The Hucksters is about a fresh out of the war soldier who always insists on being his own boss and playing by his own rules. However, in need of a job, he decides to impress a radio executive with a reputation for being extremely demanding and driving all of his employees absolutely crazy, with all of them being a nervous wreck at the mere mention of him. Somewhat surprisingly, though, he actually does manage to impress him, but soon finds himself starting to become just as determined to please him and nervous as his other employees are at the thought of failure. Then, after managing to once again impress him, after having to do one or two things he's not very proud of, he's congratulated for his success and offered exactly the job he'd been looking for all along. But instead, he opts to give the boss a scathing speech and walk out on him. And this is treated as an act of redemption on his part, but doesn't quite feel that way. Now, why is that? Well, mainly for two reasons. The first being that he never has a fall from grace to make him worthy of redemption in the first place. Because if you were to listen to that final speech, it sounds like it's coming from a man who was nearly forced to commit murder for this man, when in actuality it was nothing like that. In all honesty, he wasn't asked to do anything too out of reason. Maybe one or two things that aren't exactly fun, but let's face it, that's every job in existence. And the one time he seems to skirt the line, it's not even made clear if he's trying to blackmail him or just trying to warn him of an unfortunate truth. So unfortunately, that ends up falling flat as well because it's left too ambiguous. So to have him acting like a man who was forced through the ringer and was robbed of all of his integrity at the end like that almost makes him come across as vindictive rather than a man fighting for his own soul. Especially because the boss in question actually isn't the worst either. Sure, he is by no means anybody's dream boss, but he's shown to listen to input, will freely admit when somebody has a better idea than him, rewards hard work accordingly, and is willing to give a man every chance to rise through the ranks of his company, even if he clearly disapproves of his unconventional behavior. And you have to admit, that's not bad for the boss of a major company, is it? And that's another smaller problem. If you want him to be an analogy for the devil, he shouldn't end up coming across as reasonable or anything other than evil. And the second problem is that he brings everything on himself. Now listen, there's nothing wrong with a man who wants to play by his own rules. But that being said, then he shouldn't have even tried to get a job from a man that everybody around him is acting like a nervous wreck over. Sure, it's obvious at first that he believes he can control him, but then reality comes crashing down and he ends up becoming just like everybody else, scared to death at the thought of failure and trying to kiss up to him whenever possible. And while the movie is trying to make it look like he's on the brink of selling his soul to him, in actuality, it ends up coming across as him finally taking responsibility in his life. But then he opts to have his freedom instead and choose the boss out. And again, considering he tried so hard and insisted on getting that job in the first place, it was really all his own fault. In other words, the writing was very clearly on the wall. He should have known that if he was going to get this job, he wasn't going to get to play by his own rules. And because he didn't, that final speech can make it look like he's blaming the boss because he refuses to take responsibility for the consequences of his own actions. Now, don't get me wrong here. A story where a man goes to the devil offering his soul, literally or metaphorically, and still ends up redeeming himself can most definitely work. But what you can't do is have it repeatedly stated to the main character exactly what's going to happen to them, and they do it anyway, believing it won't, and then have their redemption be to chew out the devil for doing exactly what he told them he was going to do. And in short, that's what they did in this movie. Now, if I'm remembering correctly, I think a lot of changes were made to the movie's script at the insistence of Clark Gable, which may explain the various problems here. But simply put, as a writer myself, I can safely say that this is not how you use that template, especially in regards to his redemption. Now, to use another example you might be more familiar with, let's look at The Devil Wears Prada. Now, in this case, the analogy is extremely obvious. And to quickly summarize, the movie is about a young woman who takes a job as an assistant for a fashion mogul and finds herself being consumed by her new job at the cost of everything. Now, some people feel that this movie has a very similar problem to The Hucksters, which is to say, while the boss herself is a piece of work, it was wrong for her and her friends to treat themselves as above the fashion industry, as well as for the movie as a whole to treat it as inherently evil. However, I feel that this one could go either way depending on who's watching it and how they individually feel about it. So I only want to briefly bring up two things this movie did right over The Hucksters. And the first being that you could most definitely see why Meryl Streep's character is referred to as the devil. Even at her best, she's unapologetic in her behavior. So in this case, the analogy of her character is done much better. And the other is the main character's redemption. Because while some might argue she has nothing to redeem herself of, it was still actually pretty well done. Because in this case, she could easily chew her boss out for everything she's made her do and quit for that reason alone. But instead, it's because she realizes what she'll become if she continues on and decides she'd rather be a good person than be successful. So she instead calmly tells her that and just walks away from it all, claiming her own soul in the process. So my point here is, in this particular case, the movie as a whole doesn't exactly work because some argue that they're portraying the fashion industry as evil for no good reason. But I do feel that even for those people, her redemption can still work because it's much more about her rejecting what she could reasonably become rather than trying to make up for anything, and simply walks away rather than using the opportunity to get back at her boss, even though she would be completely justified in doing so. And for a similar reason, that's also why I feel the original ending to the 1986 Little Shop of Horrors works very well. Now, I know that this is something of a controversial opinion, but please hear me out. Because what's important to remember here is that Frank Oz made a lot of changes from the play, and one of the most important changes is Seymour. Because unlike the play, where he willingly succumbs to the plan and murders many innocent people to get what he wants, and dies in a failed attempt to redeem himself, the movie version's nothing like that. Instead, he's fighting the plant from the start, and is only very reluctantly persuaded into killing two not very nice people. And even then, he can hardly live with the guilt. Because what's important to note here is that even though he's benefiting from the plant, he's not enjoying any of it and repeatedly tries to get the plant to stop begging him to kill people before just telling it up front he won't do it again. In other words, I feel that in this case, Seymour benefits from never actually falling from grace, because it makes the movie much more about him fighting for his soul instead of fighting to get it back like all the other aforementioned examples were. In other words, he never actually sells his soul to the plan, and instead more fighting the plan to keep his soul the whole time. So as a result, I feel that the movie ending with him redeeming himself of even briefly succumbing to the plant and killing it, thus winning the battle for his soul once and for all, is much more appropriate. Because the play's ending just ends up feeling unnecessarily cruel in this case. And I guarantee you that in any other movie, his killing the plant would have been the plan from the start. Because based off the way he's behaving throughout, I feel it's only the logical conclusion. But I think I've made my point here. Okay, so to put it simply, there's a right way to use the selling your soul to the devil template and a wrong way to use it. And I hope I've made it clear what the difference between them is. But now I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe that writers get this template right or wrong more often? And do you believe my examples either way are good ones or not? Please feel free to discuss your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, thank you all for watching. I really appreciate all of it, and I hope to see you all next time.